Hi there, this is Shane, and welcome to the monthly North America Asia call. As usual, this is one of those calls where anyone can dial in and it's being recorded. So we're not quite sure who will turn up. What we do know is that there is quite the agenda to review for our audience, live or not. Before the call gets started, I'm going to put up the antitrust policy notice. We show this at the beginning of every Linux Foundation meeting. It's designed to help make sure that everyone is comfortable with the rules that we use for working together. You can find the full antitrust policy notice on our website, and if you're from a member company, you can you can contact our counsel, Andy Updegrove, with any questions. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause for around a minute, give people time to dial in and to read the antitrust statement up there. Okay, so I'm going to dive into the agenda now and just show you what's coming up. These calls always have a fixed regular agenda. The idea is that you know what we will be doing every month. Today, we're going to be going through our news. So we always have our own specification news, then SBOM news, security and OSPO news, and anything from our automation teams. Then we move into two sections, which are interactive. One is for community feedback and comments regarding our standards, and the other is to discuss our reference material. Both of these sections are where you should feel free to jump in with thoughts and comments and to contribute whatever you think might be interesting. We are informal and we want to make sure that everyone gets to talk about what they think is important. So I'm going to dive straight into the news. It is something that will replicate a lot of the news we had in our first call this month. The reason being, of course, that our audience in the first call included Europe and not Asia. And now, of course, we are doing the opposite. So diving straight in, once we get to our our section of event news, we find that the project itself has been incredibly busy. In the end of last year, we had a bunch of announcements from companies that are offering third-party services to support the security assurance specification. So in December, 6 companies announced services to support it across the market, including Buno Veritas, CAICT, and PwC, among others. This is important because it means that a bunch of both local and global companies are providing consultancy and helping people to certify to the standards. Now, this is not the only development in announced support. In January, one of our long-term partners, BitC in Germany, also announced that they're offering services to support clients around the security assurance specification. These are important developments, of course, because it's the fabric of how you get help around this standard. And just like license compliance, with these various entities supporting adoption of the security assurance specification, it means that companies find it easier than ever to actually get started. As we saw very recently, Interneuron, a provider of technology to the British National Health Service, announced their self-certification to security assurance in collaboration with Source Code Control just a short couple of weeks ago. And we do have more announcements pending of companies adopting the security assurance specification. For the specification itself, it was handed off to the Joint Development Foundation in Q4 2022, and at the very beginning of this year, they formally completed their submission of it to ISO on our behalf. That's going through something called the JTC1 pass transposition process. Basically, it means it should convert from a de facto industry standard into a formal ISO standard by around the middle to second half of this year. So quite a lot happening there, lots of exciting stuff for the security spec. Let's jump into someone else's news right now with SBOM news. The main thing that I wanted to pull up was that the SPDX project has updated their Python tools. So their Python tools to support the SPDX software bill of materials had become a bit stale. So in the end of the year, they closed 48 pull requests, 21 of which had been left open for several years. The short version of this is a modern language now has improved support for getting stuff done with the SPDX ISO standard for software bill of materials. This could be useful and interesting if you are going to implement an SBOM, which of course is a key part of our licensing and security specs, so that's important. Now, in general security news, this is more of a market note. The Open Source Security Foundation has welcomed a whole raft of new members in recent times. I'm interested especially in having a quick look at the type of associate members turning up. So we're talking about non-corporate members here. Open Forum Europe, I wanted to flag as an interesting one. They're a policy think tank in the European Union with strong connections to the Commission. Full disclosure, I'm one of the people on the General Assembly of Open Forum Europe, and I've been collaborating with them for the best part of 16 years. So I know them very well. But they are an interesting access point into European Commission development policy. They help to, I suppose, provide that bridge between corporate and government that is very useful. So that's nice to see. OSPO news, there is something happening in the Netherlands. There's an OSPology Live event happening in the Netherlands, January 23rd, 24th. I will not be there, unfortunately. I had planned to go, but something came up. However, if you do happen to be near Amsterdam, this is an event where you will find people sharing not just stuff from To-Do Group, but also things from OpenChain, Chaos, SPDX, and so on. So if you're interested in open source management, it is a place to be. On the automation news side of things, our automation work group has been busy. Marcel has contributed something I think that will be quite useful in the long term. There's a capability map that they've been working on, basically saying different types of tools here, here, and here interlink in these ways for these reasons. And this capability map is meant to help you get your head around what type of choices you'd make for automation. Automation of license scanning, automation of security scanning, automation of storing and accessing results. In other words, it's a simplistic architecture diagram that will help you dig through the options in the market. And if someone comes to you and says, hey, I have this great product for automation that can help you, you can pull out the capability map and see what exactly are they actually covering versus the whole field. And you can do the exact same thing for open source projects doing open source scanning as well. The Markdown version is a work in progress, so it's got lots of the text in Markdown. And the full old version naturally is still available. There is something exciting happening as well, and this is for those people who've been doing automation for a while. We've had a situation where there are open source tools for open source license compliance and, of course, open source security. But a lot of these tools come without a database. So you have to populate the database of here's the code base scanning, here's the licenses that apply to the packages. Now, this seems to duplicate a lot of effort because if you're doing something like the Linux kernel, the vanilla Linux kernel is being scanned by everyone again and again and again and again, right? So the obvious thing is, why don't we have a global database with some of the key packages pre-scanned? And that is something that is underway finally. In Germany, the OSADL Alliance, so that's the Automation Alliance for industry. They work on things like controller systems in factories, et cetera, are building such a database under their OSS a lot project. Now, the interesting thing here is they're making a software bill of material pre-tagged database of normal packages scanned, right? So we're talking about something that you can just ingest, and a whole bunch of common packages are scanned and ready, software bill of materials prepped. You can ingest them into any tool that supports SPDX. And this is CC0. You can take this database and do anything you want with it. I'm not saying this is a solution to the pre-filled database, but it is an interesting thing, and it's something we've been talking about for years. It's been a key weakness of getting free tools versus commercially supported tools where they come with a database. Ooh, that is a lot of news. But let's jump into the interactive section. So we'll have a little bit of a look at the standards and so on now to work on our actual specs. I see we've got Chris Wood, one of our co-chairs, on the line. It's great to see you there, Chris. And for everyone's information, I'll just run through what we're doing. So we're making updates to the ISO standard for license compliance, and we're working on the next generation of the security standard right now. The ISO standard for license compliance has been in market since 2020. So it's a few years out there. We've had some good feedback. We've always been collecting feedback. But for the next 12 months, we've decided to really lean into that and ask people specifically, hey, submit issues on GitHub, come to our calls, and actively talk about updating the standard. How do you want this adjusted for the future? It's exactly the same for the security spec. It's a very new standard. It's been out as a de facto standard since Q4 last year. But we're already looking at the next generation of it because people got excited, and security is a fast-moving field. For example, we went to Working Group Subcommittee 27 over at ISO just to show them the spec, and they came back with tons of scope suggestions. Now, that was out of play for the first version of the standard. We had set down the basic standard. We didn't want to increase scope, but it's appropriate to talk about those scope discussions, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're not quite sure when we'll release the next generation of license compliance and security standard, probably sometime 2024. Discussion underway, and this is what we're doing now. So, Chris, because you're on the call and you're all set, I'll defer to you for the mechanics of this. But would you like me to run through the two slides with people and prep the conversation, and then you can do the back and forth and share comments?
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep, no problem.
Okay. I recently became a voting member on the ISO JTC work groups for security. So I'll probably find ours in there and kind of follow it along through the process
That
for
would be fantastic.
our security specification. And for the license specification, have we started collecting comments yet on areas where people think that maybe it could be improved or embellished or expanded upon?
A great question. Yes, we have. And what I'll do is I'll just pull up an example of that. So we have it in play. So for the license specification, what we've been doing is we've been collecting ideas on the GitHub website. Just transition to that right now. Okay. On the GitHub website, we have begun collecting comments on this since actually around the time we went into ISO. I just put the link into the meeting chat as well. And basically people turned up and they had notes on areas where they think things could be clarified or improved. So to give a good example of that, here's here's a good example. This one, issue 62, which was opened not long ago, actually. This is one of the newer issues. I mean, if we scroll down, you'll see there's some from 2019. Okay, so we collected issues uh, for a while, and now we're finally editing them. But just look at this contribution one because it's a nice, simple one. It's fun to talk to. My apologies, this text might be pretty small on your screens. I'm just going to see if I can work out a way to make it a little better. Okay, this seems, GitHub seems to be reformatting it to make it smaller. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put the link in the chat as well so people can open the specific issue. So this suggestion came in, and the question was, should we revisit the contribution policy note? So in the licensing spec, we had a section 351 contributions. And basically we say if an organization considers contributions, then it should have a written policy. And the policy should be internally communicated, and there should be a process to implement the policy. And that's it. And we said there should be some verification materials. The actual policy should be written somewhere. It should be documented, obviously. The procedure that governs open source contributions should be documented. And the process for making people aware of the policy should be documented. So we kept it really light. We're saying have your policy, make sure people know about it, and make sure that those documents really exist. So there's traceability. And it was raised the question, should we have more details about what this type of policy should look like? And on our last call, there was a discussion about this, and our official mandate is to focus on the what and the why and avoid the how and the when. So we were saying if our mandate is what and why, saying that you should have a policy, you should document it, you should communicate it, and you should explain how you communicate it, that's enough. Actually explaining how the policy should work is going too far. It's becoming prescriptive. And that's an open comment. You know, the outcome of the last call was that it's appropriate to stick with what and not how. And then for this call, the question is, does that make sense to people? Do you think it's okay just to say there should be a written policy, it should be communicated, and it should be documented, not just the policy, but how you communicate it. But we don't go further, and whether that's appropriate or not. So I'll just pause there, Chris, to hand over to you you know, to mull
Yeah,
on if that type of issue capture is good or not.
I think it's totally appropriate that there is a open source contribution policy. I think that everybody needs to feel like they've got some stake in it, and offering contributions to the policy and seeing how they're accepted and rolled out in the policy is always a good thing to give people the sense of ownership. I think that the other statement that you made about it should always be prescriptive and never directive, if you want to use that word, um, is absolutely correct. And that's the same sense that I'm getting in working through the standards with IEEE and with the ISO is that all of the standards should kind of lean that way. So it's good that we were already headed in that direction anyway.
Yeah, it does seem to make sense. And I suppose one thing here, if people are on the call, but also watching this later and thinking, why? Remember, we're looking at huge amounts of different companies in different markets in different jurisdictions. So, if we start to get detailed, we're putting in place assumptions about here's how this market works, or here's how this type of company works. And that can get pretty sticky pretty fast. This is a side question, Chris. I mean, you've obviously dealt with standards for a long time. This is a curiosity rather than this issue per se, but
is it something common that sometimes people do push for prescriptive, oh, actually, we should go into really detailed how and when here, and on process standards like us, it does seem that staying away from that, staying on the what as opposed to the how, is probably the right approach. But I was wondering, just out of curiosity, do you ever get pressure in the opposite direction where people are like, no, 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 we need to be really prescriptive here?
Yes, but until you really start talking about it and who the standard is addressed to, and in the case of these standards and like for example, the IEEE standards that I'm working with, they're aimed at a global audience. And I think that in order to get a good buy-in from the global community and continued use of the specifications, I think that we do need to consider everybody's suggestions and comments about ways that we can make it better and maybe expand it or maybe be a little bit more explicit. But the bad thing that I've always found about specs is when they are written by a group of people that are more focused on one singular industry, and they get down too far into the hows that are only really applicable directly to their industry. So everyone else has to kind of back off and read it in light of, okay, well now, how might that help me? Versus having it more at a high level and saying, these are the things that you should do, and maybe here's a few places where you might want to go look to see what other specifications are saying. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. It certainly does. And that's sort of been our guiding principle from the start. And I think that's one reason we have such a diverse group of stakeholders from the get-go here, because everyone was just not finding friction, because there was nothing hitting them where they think, yeah, but in my market, my industry, my company size, that can't work. So,
Right.
yeah. Okay. So what I'll take from this then is actually we look pretty good. I mean, having our high level uh, what contribution policy requirement, but not going into the how. We didn't have any objections on the last call. On this call, we've had no objections. So then my process here would just be to make a note saying that we've had 2 calls about this. There's no objections. This issue will be closed. You can reopen it if you feel strongly about it.
So a
Type of
second for that. As a standard, normally we don't write to specific or detailed requirements. We leave the space to the company to implement the requirements.
right. So it seems just perfectly appropriate to proceed as we are. And of course, someone might come back and reopen the issue and say, no, you are all wrong. I hate what you're doing. But that's par for the course, and that's that's well within their rights, and we're all prepped for that. And we'll deal with that discussion if and when it arises. Okay, that's only the first of the interesting issues to chew over. The next one is a little bit heavier. And, I'm just pulling up my slides again. So it looked, the first one we did was this: should we revisit contribution policy? The next one that's pre-prepped is a 2-parter. It's a definition in section 2.4 of license compliance. And it's exactly the same thing in 2.7 of security assurance. And basically, it's a definition about open source. I'm just going to put the 2 links into our chat just for reference. This is license compliance and this is security. But what I'll do is I'll share the screen right now to actually show us what's what. Okay, so on license compliance, an issue is open saying that we have a definition of open source. And our definition is that open source is software subject to 1 or more licenses that meet the open source definition published by OSI or the free software definition published by FSF or a similar license. Over on our security assurance spec, a comment was opened saying, maybe that's something we need to revisit. I'm just going to pull open security now. So what happened here is the security spec one is almost identical. It's open source definition, free software definition. It doesn't have or similar license here. So it's actually a mismatch between these two specs that we should probably harmonize. So it's exactly the same on security spec. It just misses the final statement or similar license. For some reason, that was omitted in our drafting. Anyway, there was a message from CAICT. This is Discovery, Jinxia at CAICT. For background, that's the Chinese Academy of Information and Communication Technology. It's an organization under the Chinese Ministry of Trade. So it's an organization working on government policy around open source and standards. And she raised a thing, excuse me, it's machine translation. Okay, so it might be shaky, but she raised the thing that there have been court cases which don't agree that the open source software definition or the free software definition are necessarily canonical regarding what is open source. And she cited a case which was Neo4j Incorporated versus PureThink in the Ninth Circuit Court of California. And in that case, what happened was the court didn't decide that the OSI definition was the canonical open source. They considered a Swedish license in play to be open source. And this was interesting to Jinxia, and she also noted that in our security, our license compliance spec, in practice, we're solving a lot of problems where different definitions of what's going on. This is open source, this is not open source, are being caught as well. So she basically said, I don't think that the open source definition by OSI or the free software definition by FSF are necessarily a single source of truth over what open source is. And what she meant by that is that the market might have evolved over time. So we might want to discuss this further. Now, I want to give some context. This is something that comes up about once every 2 or 3 years, right? So we've gone through the definition of open source before, and what we're doing now is we're going back to it yet again. And her purpose here wasn't to force us to change the definition. Her purpose was to flag that we probably should talk about this again. And therefore, that's what we're doing. The question at play is there are occasionally different understandings of what open source is. Our current standard says use the open source definition or the free software definition. In the licensing spec, it then says or similar, and in security, it doesn't say or similar. So the question at play is what we are currently doing good enough? And then the second question at play is license spec includes or similar, security doesn't include or similar, should we harmonize them? And if so, how should we harmonize them?
Well, I think in the long run, yes, they should be harmonized. We shouldn't have two different definitions, even though it's could be considered a trivial difference, but it is a difference. I would have to look at the Swedish license in English and then consult with some knowledgeable intellectual property people to see what they think about that, because I've found several opinions that I've read in the last 10 years that have come out of the Northern Court of California that have been rather odd. it almost like the judge doesn't really understand open source software, but without having the references that they're looking at, maybe spot on the money. So we ought to take a look at it.
A really good point. So what I'll do then is I'll just add there that harmonization does look important. And I mean, I concur with that. If we end up with lots of little friction points between our standards, it will just slow down family adoption for no reason, right? We're not going to lose anything by harmonizing, but we could lose something by having that tiny piece of friction in there on the approval process.
Right.
And when it comes to the or similar point, I have to leave security spec. I have to go back to the license compliance spec. Unfortunately, the conversation is split between these two open issues. Okay. So Yari said he thinks that when it comes to harmonization, basically the or similar from license compliance seems like it could work with the security spec. So the security spec currently says use the OSI definition or the FSF definition, full stop. And licensing says use OSI or FSF or similar, full stop. And Yari says, well, it doesn't really matter if something is OSI approved or FSF approved. It just matters that we set context. And he says for that reason, he thinks or similar is fine. It allows people to take a different path. And he's basically saying harmonization works. But we did have a small objection from Helio, which might be worth chewing on. And Helio said he didn't like or similar. He says he thinks it's not usually accepted very well with license compliance because it opens the possibility that people could undermine the intent of the licensing. So you could have a situation where your supplier says, yeah, we're going to send you open source. And you get this stuff, which they say is similar to OSI and FSF, but it completely blows open your policy. So what Helio's suggesting is, whether we need to raise the question about whether the current deck of licenses that we're dealing with in practice were created around the OSI and FSF definitions, or they were created on their own, and whether we need some kind of new definition to fit them. So basically what Helio is saying is, in practice for the market, we should probably work out if the market licenses in play actually fit the OSI definition or the FSF definition, or if those two definitions have, and I paraphrase here, become dinosaurs in the marketplace, right? If they somehow are unconnected with what we're dealing with. And for those people who are completely new to the topic, quite frankly, most of the licenses fit both the OSI definition and FSF definition. Licenses like GPL or Apache or BSD, they all fit both definitions in market. So if we do a quick analysis of the top 10 or 20 licenses and a sanity check that they fit into those definitions, then citing OSI and FSF matches market reality, and that's fine. So what I raised there is that Yari thinks or similar works fine. Helio thinks that or similar doesn't work fine, or at least we should double check if the current definitions fit. And if they do fit, he implicitly suggests it would appear that we stick with them. Because if we introduce too much vagueness, it's possible that completely incompatible models of open source will be in play, which might introduce a supply chain complexity. So your supplier is like, yeah, I'm definitely providing you with open source, and you find it doesn't fit OSI or FSF definitions. It's something else, and you don't actually have the internal policy and processes to deal with this or something else. It's an interesting point. Something to mull on.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. I guess I've been doing this for so long that I don't really care about OSI or Free Software Foundation, or I'm really reading the license for what it is. And unless you're dealing with a real basic license that basically says, here's a software, you can do whatever you want to, as long as you will make the source code available to anyone you distribute it to, it kind of fits around that definition that he was talking about, source available.
Right.
There's too many nuances, and especially in this day and time, you still run across a lot of the formal licenses like GPL version 2 and LGPL 2.1 and GPL version 3 and BSD 2 clause and so forth and so on. And those kind of fit those standards. But then there are too many other licenses that are variations of those that were originally developed for a university, but then somebody's taken them off and added some additional verbiage to it. So you can't really call it directly a BSD or an MIT license anymore. It's some variant of those licenses. So I'm not sure that if you pin yourself down to only using the definitions by several foundations and groups, that you're probably doing the best thing to support your case. I think really it's the opposite of that. If it doesn't offer access to the source, then you shouldn't be dealing with it in an open source system. And you should reject it and tell them to go talk to whoever's doing your procurement for you.
You know, I think you touched on something really good. You articulated it in a way we probably need to articulate more often. In practice, in the market, there's a lot of different licenses out there that won't necessarily fit these definitions, but they're darn close, and you are dealing with them. Yes. So the or similar kind of hits that on the head. It's saying, you know, close but no cigar, but it's what we're dealing with today. And therefore, you just have to have the capability internally to deal with what's in play in your market domain.
Right. It opens it up and it says that I'm the copyright holder and I'm giving you this set of the rights that go with the copyright definition. And within these bounds, you can use the software in any way that you want to, but it has to be within the bounds that they establish. Some of them may say that you can't redistribute it using the name of their software on it. Some of them don't say that at all. So, you know, I think if we start writing rules around specific groups only, that we're going to limit people's flexibility in reviewing and coming to some consensus on their following the process, because too many licenses don't exactly fit.
It's a very good point. And you know, one thing that the audience should always be aware with is that OpenChain we're not dealing with the theoretical perfection here. We're dealing with the market reality. So this seems to hit the nail on the head that it might be messy to say or similar because it means it's not tied in a bow, but that's our world. So maybe that's the comment we're digging out here, that everything won't fit the definition. Still, they help set the tone for the kind of domain you should expect. So this stuff or similar is probably what you should expect as source. If something is dramatically different, you should probably say, well, okay, let's talk more about that one.
Right. And maybe that should be a conversation piece in the edits for the next edition of the specification.
A great point.
The other day we were assessing a piece of software and it had a license in it that was 100% Japanese.
Oh.
And I don't read Japanese. Nobody in the company that was dealing with licensing was conversant enough in Japanese to be able to read it and say, yeah, that's the same as the BSD 2 clause license or whatever. So we ran it through the language translator at Google and we got an output and compared that with the original license that it kind of resembled, and it was pretty close.
And in that case, if you could understand the basic obligations, you were able to say, okay, we'll run with this. Okay. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, so what I'll do then on the annotation, I'll do a quick annotation on this after the call, and everyone feel free to jump in, correct, and expand it. I'll just make a note that or similar seems to deal with the market situation, and harmonization between the two is important. So what seems to be in play is that we give two examples and then say or similar. It's up to people to determine what's the line on or similar, but it's not our job to just say, you gotta use these definitions only. You're locked into this, whether you like it or not. So probably just using what's in the licensing spec appears to fly well. And then we throw that comment out to the community, see what happens.
Yeah.
All right.
And I think that's a good way to go.
One thing you reminded me, Chris, this is a side note, but I just noticed Japan's increased its budget on defense, and it's purchasing, I think, I could have this wrong. It's expanded its purchase for this year onto 8 Lightnings, the new Lightning II jet fighter, and I think it's got 8 of the Type A and 8 of the Type B in procurement, right? So Japan's obviously doing a lot of extra procurement around these fighters, and I'm sure that what's happening then is there's tremendous conversation, not just on what aspects will be co-build, what will be in Japan, and so on, but on all of that software transfer, and goodness knows how many software systems are transferring. And I just love the point that you brought that, licenses are flying in every direction. And when you're in a country like Japan, you're often looking at procurement of a complex object like a jet fighter comes in with a ton of English language licenses. And the companies are always like, oh my God, this is hard to parse. But you also raise the point that we must never forget that it's a two-way street nowadays. It's perfectly possible that you'll be getting your licenses in Japanese and Chinese, and you'll be doing machine translation, and you'll be looking at the OSI definition, which is in English, and its license list of English language licenses, and you'll be like, oh boy, are we close or what?
Yeah, and then pretty soon it's going to be close only works in horseshoes, hand grenades, and open source software.
I like that one. I like that one.
Until we find the first IP lawyer that's out there trolling for copyright infringement.
Yes.
They have a challenge for your interpretation of the machine language translation of a license.
I suppose one of the great fortunes of the licenses is that the key terms are probably well enough defined that even machine translation will pull out the key terms. So in most cases in the practical market, we're going to be just fine, unless a license goes into incredible length on its terms, as opposed to, yeah.
And there are some of those.
You get 180 pages of TNC and you're thinking, well, sure, whatever. And that's actually it on the specs for this call. Next month, as we start in 2 weeks when we have the North America Europe call, my suggestion is we open new issues. But on this call, I think we're good. We covered the contribution policy point, and we touched on the definitions of open source point. And the outcome on contribution policy was we're fine. And on the definitions, basically it's we're fine, plus we'll harmonize between the two, which isn't a bad outcome, I think. Going through this stuff, mulling it, that's how you revise a standard. And sometimes you think, yeah, we're good.
And I think that I've worked with Helio on the IEEE specification, some specification in the last year, and he's usually got some pretty good comments to make. They're insightful and cause everybody to stop and think. So I don't ever mind seeing anything like that.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's, again, a side note. some for the audience who might be relatively new to this, sometimes I get comments from people and they're like, why are you looking at something fundamental like this? Are you going to change everything? And the answer is, the point of these processes is to discuss this stuff. And quite often we're going to discuss it and say we're fine. But it's important to be able to go back and say, in this standard, are we suitable for the market as we see it today, right now? So like you said, it's healthy.
Yeah, I agree, because you can become irrelevant too quick if you don't consider what the market is doing and changes that have been initiated or suggested by groups of people.
Absolutely. And it's sad to see, the situation where you have standards that nailed it in the market at one point, and just for one reason or another don't anymore, and then you end up with a new standard that is substantially replicating but fresher, and you're thinking, I don't know, man, maybe that could have been done differently. Chris is smiling with the knowledge of many years of this stuff unfolding.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to pull up the next section if there's no objection, which is just Nathan's section. We're not going to dig too far into it. I'm just making a note or two. The work on the reference material today is pretty lightweight. So Nathan has been working on a document which is pointing out reference material. I just put the link in our chat. Nathan is the chair of education. And he's been having a look at our reference material, our library, and been saying, some of this stuff looks like it's important to edit, maybe include more explicitly on the website. And what he wants to do is later this week, Thursday, 5 p.m. Pacific, which will be 7 p.m. Central in the US. It'll be late. Was it Thursday, 5 p.m.? I might have got that wrong. I think we might have adjusted it. Let me double check. I do apologize. He said he changed the timing to 9 a.m. Pacific. So it's going to be 11 a.m. Central. It's going to be the middle of the night in Japan. It's going to be 2 a.m. here. It's going to be 1 a.m. in China, but it'll be afternoon in Europe, UTC and Central European time. So on Thursday, 9 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Central, Nathan will have an educational call. He'll be having a look at this document where he has some resources cited, and he'll be saying, are these the resources that you need to see in front of you, that your suppliers need to see? Do we put them on the website, and do we refresh these resources? So it's a deep dive. And that's an advisable call for those who are interested in helping with the reference material around the standards. Now, I just wanted to give you an example. The website is getting a lot of refresh. So the front page of the website is improving, hopefully improving. Not so beautiful in this particular one because the border has gone around my image and cut off some of the edges. But the website is getting easier to read. You land on the website, it sort of talks about our mission. It says what we're up to. It immediately cites things like the number that 20% of companies in Germany with more than 2,000 employees are already using our ISO standard for open source license compliance based on a survey with Bitkom and PwC. So the website is iterating. It's hopefully getting cleaner and easier to use. And Nathan's call on Thursday will be part of the process of looking at our material and thinking, how do we get this right in your face when you hit the website? So you have the stuff you need to adopt the standards, to help your suppliers adopt them, or to iterate on your processes. Okay, so Nathan is active on that. He asked for a whole hour, so that's why he's not doing it on this call. Okay, so he wants to.
Is that on the calendar?
It is on the global calendar. So you'll find it on the global calendar, and it should be good. But I will be emailing it to the list. I sent one email yesterday with an attached calendar invite, and I will be sending it again before his meeting, so everyone will have a ping on that.
Okay, I think I accepted that one.
Yep, I think so. And, highly recommended, if possible, for people to go and have a look. see what's going on there. And I think it'll be useful. And part of the valid stuff we'll do, I'm going to pull up the actual page just for reference. Part of the valid stuff we'll do is you might look at this and think, the material you're saying we should look at. Here's the link. The material you're saying we should look at, like this path to conformance document you're creating, or this leaflet for suppliers, this is good, but we're completely missing a checklist for XYZ, and I need that checklist. This is the kind of conversation that he wants to have, and then we have a situation that maybe you're looking at something like the path to conformance, and you're saying the path to conformance is a good idea, but this one that we have right now is so basic it doesn't even begin to solve my problem. Or conversely, you could say this path to conformance has levels which I don't want. It's just confusing. So Nathan wants to dig into all of that, and that's why he wants an hour.
Okay.
I think his plan, not to put words in his mouth, but I think his plan is to set the context, to pick the key documents to work on and prep them, and then put them front and center on the website so people see them in the first few seconds.
Okay.
All right. So that's on Thursday, 9 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Central. And that's it. That's all of our big stuff for the meeting. We're on to any other business. Does anyone have any topic they'd like to raise? If not, the recording of this call will be available within 24 to 48 hours. Chris, thank you for the strategic input on this one. I think it really helps set the tone, and particularly for people who are coming into this blind and thinking, how do we talk about this stuff? How do we begin to edit a standard? I think this was very useful, and thank you so much for your time on this.
You're welcome.
Close the meeting, everyone. Thank you for those watching live, and thank you for those who will have just watched the recording. And Chris, have a beautiful day in what appears to be a snowy hellscape.
Say what?
A snowy hellscape out there. It looks like the end of the world you've got in your background. It's beautiful, but chilly.
That's a maple tree farm in Vermont. My uncle's.
Oh my goodness, it's your uncle's farm. That must be fun to go hiking.
Oh, it is, but don't go during this time of year, because that's when you're boiling the maple syrup, and that's when you start it in the morning, you don't leave until it's all done.
Oh my goodness.
Many
Yeah.
hot wood fire.
Still, it's a heck of a thing. It must be beautiful syrup, by the way. It must be great to get it straight from the family.
I'll put another picture up there next time.
It's a deal. All right, Chris, have a beautiful day. Everyone, see you next time. Take care all.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Thank
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.